People always warned me that silence could be dangerous. They just never told me it could also be a weapon. I want you to sit with that for a second before I tell you anything else about my story. Because what I'm about to share with you is not a tale about revenge in the explosive, dramatic way you might be imagining. It's quieter than that. It's slower. And honestly, that's what makes it so much more satisfying. My name is Claire, and for 10 years, I built something extraordinary in a room my husband called the craft room. He wasn't entirely wrong about the room, I suppose. It did start out that way. There was a folding table, a second-hand desk chair that squeaked every time I shifted my weight, and 3 mismatched bookshelves I'd found at a garage sale and painted white because I thought white made things look more professional. It smelled like coffee and dry erase markers, and in the summer, a little bit like the lavender candle I burned to keep myself calm when the numbers didn't add up. But Mark never walked into that room and saw what I saw. He walked in and saw clutter. He walked in and saw his wife playing pretend. And for a long time, too long, if I'm being honest with myself, I let him. Let me take you back to the beginning, because that's where the real story lives. Not in the boardroom, not in the lawsuit, not in the moment I watched the color drain from his face across a mahogany conference table. The real story starts somewhere much more ordinary. It starts at a kitchen table in a small apartment in Austin, Texas, on a Tuesday night in October, when I was 29 years old, and the person I loved most in the world laughed at my dream for the very first time. We had been married for 2 years. Mark was on the rise at Vertex Systems, one of those aggressive, fast-growing tech firms that collected talented young men the way some people collect vintage cars. He was sharp, charming, and magnetic in a way that made rooms feel different when he entered them. I fell in love with his confidence first, I think. That certainty he carried about himself, like he always knew exactly where he was going and exactly how he was going to get there. I admired it. I think I even tried to absorb it by proximity, the way you might try to stay warm by standing close to a fire. I had a background in materials engineering. I'd finished my master's degree 2 years before we got married, and I'd spent those early career years working at a mid-sized firm doing composite research, the kind of work that is deeply technical, genuinely exciting to maybe 400 people on the planet, and invisible to everyone else. I liked it. I was good at it, but I had ideas that stretched further than my employer was willing to go. And after years of watching those ideas get filed under interesting, but not commercially viable, I started to wonder what would happen if I just did it myself. So that Tuesday night, I spread out my notes on the kitchen table. Pages and pages of them. Material specifications, early prototype sketches, a rough business plan I'd been drafting for 3 months in the margins of my lunch breaks. I was nervous, but the good kind of nervous. The kind that lives right next to excitement and sometimes gets mistaken for it. I told Mark I wanted to start my own company. I told him I'd been working on a new approach to thermal management materials, components that could revolutionize heat dissipation in high-performance electronics. I know that sounds technical and dry, but the implications were enormous. We're talking about the backbone of next-generation semiconductors, the kind of materials that companies like Vertex Systems would eventually need to remain competitive. I explained all of this. My voice was steady. My hands were not. Mark listened. He nodded in the places where you nod when you're being polite rather than present. And when I finished, he picked up his fork, speared a piece of chicken, and said, "Claire, that sounds like a really cute side project." Cute. I remember the exact weight of that word, how it landed in the center of my chest like something small but sharp. I didn't fight back. I just said, "I think it could be more than that." He smiled the way you smile at someone who says they're going to run a marathon when they've never jogged around the block. Tolerant, indulgent, already moving on. "Sure, babe," he said. "Just don't let it take over the house." That was the first time. It would not be the last. I started the company anyway. I named it Maren Technologies, after my grandmother, a woman who had built a small textile business with her own hands in rural Georgia and put 4 kids through college on the proceeds. She never once asked for anyone's permission to be taken seriously. I figured I could borrow a little of that energy. The early days were genuinely brutal, and I don't want to gloss over that, because I think people who tell entrepreneurship stories sometimes skip this part, the part where it's just pain and doubt and exhaustion and numbers that don't work. And that dishonesty does a disservice to everyone who's sitting in their own version of that room right now, wondering if they're crazy for continuing. I was working 60, sometimes 70 hours a week. I had 2 part-time contractors helping me, both of them women I'd met through an engineering network, both of them brilliant, both of them willing to work for below-market rates because they believed in the direction of the research. I was paying myself almost nothing. Every dollar we generated went straight back into materials and equipment and the slow, painstaking process of filing patent applications. Meanwhile, Mark was getting promoted, first to senior director, then to VP of product innovation. His salary doubled, his travel schedule tripled. He started coming home with the particular energy of someone who had been told all day that they are exceptional, and that energy needs somewhere to land when you walk through the front door. And the place it landed, increasingly, was on me. Not in any dramatic way. Mark was never violent. He was never what anyone would clinically call abusive. And I want to be precise here, because imprecision in these things does its own kind of damage. What he was dismissive, consistently, persistently, almost artistically dismissive. He started referring to Maren Technologies as the hobby. Then, as it grew slightly, as the craft room operation. He told our friends, at dinner parties I had spent the afternoon preparing food for while he responded to emails, that I was playing CEO in the spare bedroom. He said it with this affectionate, exasperated tone, the kind reserved for children who insist on wearing capes to the grocery store. Everyone laughed because he was charming, and the framing was charming. And I sat at the end of the table and smiled because the alternative, making a scene, defending myself in my own dining room, felt worse in the moment than just absorbing it. I absorbed a lot of things in those years. I absorbed the way he'd walk past my office door and glance in with this expression that was equal parts pity and mild embarrassment, like he was looking at someone engaged in a very elaborate delusion. I absorbed the times he'd mention, casually, that we didn't really need the money, so I shouldn't stress myself out over it, as if the money were the point and not the work, not the patents, not the years of research. I absorbed the Christmas when he gave me a new coffee maker for the craft room, and said it was so I'd at least be comfortable while I was puttering around in there. Puttering. I was, at the time, 3 months away from filing our second patent. Here's what I want you to understand about those years, because it matters for everything that comes later. The dismissal didn't break me. I want to be clear about that. There were nights when I sat in that room after midnight, when the house was quiet, and the only sound was the hum of my computer and the occasional creak of the house settling, and I felt something that was close to despair. Yes, I won't lie about that. I felt the specific loneliness of being someone who is not seen by the person who is supposed to see you most clearly. But I also felt something else in those moments, something harder and quieter and more durable. I felt certain. Not the loud, chest-thumping certainty that Mark carried around with him everywhere he went. A different kind. The kind that doesn't need an audience because it isn't performing for one. The kind that just keeps its head down and does the work, and trusts that the work will eventually say everything that needs to be said. I filed patent number 1 in the spring of year 3. It covered a novel composite material I'd developed that dramatically improved thermal conductivity in micro-scale electronics applications. The technical specifics aren't important here, but the implications are. The direction the semiconductor and high-performance computing industries were heading meant that anyone who wanted to build the next generation of processors was going to hit a thermal ceiling. And my material was one of the most elegant solutions anyone had found to that problem. The patent attorney I worked with, a woman named Sandra, who became something close to a friend over the years, told me that day in her office that what I had was significant. That word, significant, sat differently in my body than cute ever had. I called Mark on the way home. I told him we'd just filed our first patent and that Sandra believed it was strong. There was a pause. Then, "That's great, hun. Hey, I'm about to go into a meeting. Can we talk tonight?" We didn't talk that night. He had a work dinner. He came home after I'd gone to sleep, and by morning the moment had passed and neither of us retrieved it. I filed patent number 2 18 months later. This one was broader, a processing methodology that complemented the first material and made it significantly more manufacturable at scale, more commercially viable, more valuable. By this point, Maren Technologies had 4 full-time employees, a small but respectable list of clients doing early-stage validation work with our materials, and the beginning of a reputation in certain very specific circles as a company to watch. Mark, to my knowledge, remained completely unaware of any of this, not because I hid it from him, but because he never asked. Not once in all those years did he sit down across from me and say, "Tell me what you're working on. Tell me what you're building. Tell me where this is going." The topic of Maren Technologies existed in our marriage, the way a piece of furniture exists in a room you've stopped really looking at, present, but invisible through sheer familiarity and disinterest. Patent number 3 came in year 7, and this one was the one that changed everything, though I didn't know it in the way I know it now. This patent covered an integration architecture, the specific method by which my materials could be incorporated into the manufacturing process of next-generation chips in a way that was both proprietary and, crucially, difficult to design around. It was the kind of patent that, if you were a company building certain categories of technology, You could not simply ignore and root around. You would need it, or you would need to develop something equivalent at enormous cost, or you would fall behind. Sandra, when she called to tell me the patent had been approved, said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "Claire, you should start thinking about what you want to do with this, because this isn't a small thing anymore. This is something people are going to come looking for." I thanked her and hung up and sat in the craft room for a long time. I thought about the coffee maker Mark had given me. I thought about every dinner party, every tolerant smile, every time the word puttering had been deployed in my direction. I thought about the version of me who had spread those pages on the kitchen table 10 years ago, nervous and hopeful, and trying so hard to be taken seriously by the person who was supposed to already believe in her. I thought, not yet. Not quite yet. And I kept building. I need to tell you about the shift I noticed in Mark, because looking back, it happened gradually and then all at once, the way those things do. And I think I understood it before I let myself understand it, if that makes any sense. Around year 8, something changed in the atmosphere of our marriage. I don't mean anything dramatic. I mean the small climate shifted. The way a room feels different before a storm, even when the sky is still blue. Mark started coming home later, which wasn't unusual, but there was a new quality to his distraction, a guardedness. His phone, which had always been present but manageable, became a third presence in every room. He started tilting the screen away from me in a way that was almost practiced. He started taking calls in the garage. I noticed. I want to be honest about the fact that I noticed, and I chose, for a period of time, not to look directly at what I was seeing. This is something I have had to sit with and examine, because I don't think it was weakness exactly. I think it was grief management. I think some part of me understood that once I looked directly at it, everything would change, and I wasn't ready for everything to change in that particular moment. I was also, not incidentally, in the middle of the most significant business negotiation of my life. Because in year 8, the industry had started to catch up to where I had been for years. Vertex Systems, Mark's company, had announced an ambitious new product roadmap that hinged on exactly the kind of thermal management and integration technology that Maren Technologies had spent nearly a decade developing and patenting. Their engineers, I was told by someone who would know, were running into walls. The walls were mine, technically speaking. I had begun to receive inquiries. Careful, professional, exploratory inquiries from companies interested in licensing discussions. I handled them with Sandra at my side, listened to everything, committed to nothing, kept building. Then, one evening in the spring of what would turn out to be the last year of my marriage, I came home early from a trip. I want to be careful here about how I tell this part, because it involves a degree of privacy I have not entirely resolved how I feel about disclosing. But what I can tell you is this. I found enough to understand what was happening. I found enough to know that the careful, distracted, phone-tilting version of Mark, who had been coming home late for 18 months, was not a man going through a professional rough patch. And I found enough to know that I had been operating for some period of time under a completely false understanding of the stability of my own life. I sat with it overnight. I didn't cry, which surprised me in the moment and makes more sense to me now. I think you can only be so blindsided by something you were, on some level, already bracing for. 2 days later, I received a call from Mark's office at Vertex. He wasn't the one calling. His assistant was, on behalf of Mark's new title, Chief Technology Officer, asking if Maren Technologies would be available for a preliminary licensing discussion. I want you to understand the particular flavor of that moment. My husband's company, which he had been building his career at for 11 years, the company whose board he attended dinners for, and whose stock options he checked each morning before he checked on me, was calling the business he had spent a decade dismissing as a craft room hobby to ask for help. I told his assistant that I would be in touch. I did not tell Mark that the call had come in, and that decision, that single small act of information management, was the moment the game changed. What I did instead was call an old contact of mine, a woman named Patricia Voss, who was the VP of Strategic Acquisitions at Global Nexus. For those of you unfamiliar with the industry, Global Nexus was Vertex Systems' largest and most formidable competitor. They were bigger, better funded, and for the past 3 years had been quietly losing ground to Vertex in one specific but critical technology category. Exactly the category my patents touched. Patricia and I had met at a conference 5 years earlier. She had been one of the few people in that room who had asked me genuinely curious questions about my work. We had stayed loosely in touch. I called her now and said, simply, that I thought we should have a conversation and that she should bring her best people. She called back within the hour. While I was scheduling that meeting, I also retained a divorce attorney. Her name was Diane Kessler, and she had a reputation in Austin for being exceptionally thorough and exceptionally unsentimentally focused on outcomes. I want to be precise about the order of operations here, because people have since assumed that I moved on Mark as an act of retaliation, and I want to correct that narrative, because it isn't quite right. The decision to explore an acquisition with Global Nexus was a business decision based on business logic that had been developing for years. Maren Technologies was at a natural inflection point. I was always going to have to decide what to do next: sell, license, scale independently. The arrival of that particular moment in my personal life did not create the decision. It clarified the timing. And the timing, I will admit, turned out to be rather precise. The Global Nexus conversations moved quickly. Patricia was serious. Her team was serious. And what they were looking at was serious. My 3 patents, particularly in combination, represented something that could shift the competitive landscape in their favor in a way that 5 years of internal R&D had failed to achieve. They understood the value. They were not inclined to lowball. The due diligence process was 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which I went home each evening to a house where Mark was increasingly tense and distracted, where dinners were quiet, where the specific politeness of 2 people who are no longer truly present with each other had settled in permanently. He didn't ask about work. I didn't volunteer. Once he looked up from his laptop and said, almost absently, "You know Vertex is probably going to reach out to you about some kind of licensing deal for the patents." He said it casually, as if the patents were something he had known about all along and had simply not been mentioning, as if his awareness of them was continuous and comfortable rather than recent and motivated. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I'll keep that in mind." He went back to his laptop. I went back to mine. Sandra and I, working with Global Nexus's legal team, finalized the acquisition terms in the 7th week. I will not disclose the exact figure because some of the terms are still under confidentiality agreement. But I will tell you this. It was generational. It was the kind of number that changes the shape of a person's future in every conceivable direction. It represented 10 years of nights after midnight, 10 years of a squeaking chair and lavender candles, and a husband who thought I was puttering around in there. It was also because of the exclusivity structure of the deal, something that had an immediate and severe implication for Vertex Systems. Because Global Nexus did not purchase a license. They purchased the company, and they purchased it with full exclusivity on all 3 patents and the associated technology, which meant that Vertex Systems, which had been approaching Maren Technologies about a licensing arrangement, was now permanently locked out. The technology they needed to execute their roadmap was going to their biggest competitor, and there was nothing anyone could do about it, because I had built it, I had owned it, and I had the absolute legal right to sell it to whoever I chose. The acquisition closed on a Thursday. Mark filed for divorce on a Friday. Or rather, I should say that the papers arrived on Friday, because the timeline I later pieced together suggested they had been in preparation for some time. There had been an attorney. There had been financial restructuring. There had been, I suspect, a certain confidence that the math would work out in a particular way, that I would be walking away from this marriage with my craft room equipment and whatever modest valuation a small specialty materials company might attract, and that he would be walking away with the Vertex stock options and the decade of compounding salary and the financial architecture he'd been building in his name. I sat with the divorce papers for the better part of an afternoon. I thought about the kitchen table and the chicken and the word cute. I thought about the Christmas coffee maker. I thought about every single dinner party. Then I called Diane Kessler and told her to proceed. The first sign that something had changed at Vertex came 48 hours after the acquisition closed, in the form of a terse, puzzled email from Mark, sent at 11:30 at night, that read, "Did you have some kind of deal with Global Nexus? Their PR team just issued a press release." I read it twice. Then I set my phone down and went to sleep. The full picture emerged over the following week. Vertex's stock responded poorly to the news that Global Nexus had acquired the patent portfolio they had been quietly counting on. Their Q3 roadmap, which had been announced to investors with a certain amount of confidence, was now in question. Mark's position as CTO, which was defined substantially by his ability to deliver on that roadmap, was now in question. The board meetings, I heard later from people who were there, were not pleasant. I was not at those meetings, but I was at a different one. Patricia Voss, who was now effectively my primary business contact at Global Nexus, given my ongoing role as a technical consultant to the acquisition, had been asked by Global Nexus leadership to participate in what was framed as a preliminary strategic conversation with Vertex Systems. The kind of meeting that happens when one company needs something the other company has, and both sides understand that a negotiation is inevitable. Patricia asked me to attend in my consulting capacity. I said yes. I want to describe this room to you, because rooms matter in stories like this. And this room was something I will never forget. It was a conference room on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Austin. The table was long and dark and polished, to the point where you could see the overhead lights reflected in its surface. There were 8 people on the Global Nexus side. There were 7 people on the Vertex side. Mark was one of the 7. He didn't know I would be there. I am certain of that, because I saw his face when I walked in. And what I saw there was not the tolerant, indulgent expression I had spent 10 years on the receiving end of. What I saw was something much more complex and much less comfortable, something that started as recognition and moved quickly through confusion and landed, after 2 or 3 long seconds, somewhere that looked a great deal like the specific humiliation of a person who has just understood the full shape of a situation they had not been paying attention to. I sat down across from him. I did not smile in the way that would have been satisfying, but would also have been small. I smiled the way you smile in a professional meeting, neutrally and briefly. And then I opened my notebook and uncapped my pen and directed my attention to Patricia, who was introducing the agenda. The meeting was about licensing terms, of course. Vertex needed access to the technology. Global Nexus was willing to discuss it, at a price and on terms that reflected the leverage they now held. My role was to answer technical questions and provide guidance on the scope and specifications of the patents, which I did, precisely and professionally, for 2.5 hours. Mark spoke perhaps 4 times. He was composing himself, I could see that, and I gave him credit for it, because it was clearly requiring effort. At one point, his legal counsel asked a clarifying question about the coverage of patent number 3, and I answered it with a detail and fluency that I watched Mark register with a particular expression, one I had never seen on his face before, and recognized nonetheless as something like being seen. After the meeting, in the elevator lobby, he approached me. His team was still inside. Mine had filtered out ahead of me. He said, "Claire." I said, "Mark." He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was quieter than I expected, "How long?" I knew what he was asking. How long had it been this significant? How long had I known what I had? How long had I been in that room, building something that was more than what he had told his friends? It was at dinner parties. I considered several answers. I thought about the kitchen table. I thought about 10 years of being called cute and little, and a hobby and a craft room. I said, "Since the beginning, Mark. Since the very beginning." Then I put my badge in my bag and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I want to be careful about how I end this story, because I'm aware that what people often want from stories like this is a crescendo, a moment of pure triumph that lands like a fist on a table. And I don't want to lie to you about what I actually felt, which was quieter than that, and, I think, more honest. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. The terms, given the circumstances, were less favorable for Mark than he had anticipated when he'd engaged the attorney the previous fall. Diane Kessler is, as I mentioned, very thorough. Vertex systems did not collapse. I want to be accurate here. They restructured. They renegotiated their roadmap with investors. They licensed certain technology from Global Nexus under terms that were not comfortable for them, and paid for that discomfort in quarterly earnings for the better part of 2 years. Mark's position as CTO was eliminated in the restructuring. He moved to a smaller firm in Seattle. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he is doing fine, which I am, genuinely, not unhappy about. I am still in Austin. I have an office now, a real one, not in my home, with windows that look out over the city and a team of 23 people who are building the next set of things I believe in. I don't burn lavender candles anymore, not because I don't like them, but because the anxiety that made them necessary has largely left the building. I think about that woman at the kitchen table sometimes, the one with the shaking hands and the pages and the terrible nervous hope of someone about to show someone they love the truest version of themselves. I think about what I would tell her if I could. I think I would tell her, the room is enough. The work is enough. You don't need him to see it for it to be real. You don't need anyone to validate what you're building while you're building it. The validation will come, and it will come in a form that is so much more permanent than a nod across a dinner table. It will come in the form of the thing itself, solid and documented and undeniable, on a day when the room it's sitting in will matter a great deal to people who once couldn't be bothered to look. Keep building, that's all. Just keep building. The people who laugh will eventually need what you've made. And on that day, you won't need to say a single word, because everything that needs to be said will already be signed, sealed, and sitting in a folder with your name at the top. Before I go, I want to say something directly to you, the person who has been with me through this whole story. If any part of what I shared today felt familiar, the dismissal, the invisible work, the loneliness of being underestimated by someone who was supposed to be on your side, then you already know what I'm about to say. You don't need permission. You don't need anyone's belief in you to proceed. What you need is the discipline to stay in the room, the patience to let the work accumulate, and the faith that one day the work will do all the talking. If this story meant something to you, if it gave you even a small piece of something you needed today, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story, because every week we bring you another real, raw, deeply human account of the people who kept going when the world told them to stop. Leave a comment below. I read every single one, and I want to know, has anyone ever underestimated you? What did you do with it? Let's talk. Let's build something together, right here in the comments. Because the craft room, it turns out, was always exactly big enough